Today, we're going to demonstrate best practice for maintaining and rebuilding a Jerguson Series 20 armored transparent gauge. The tools you'll need to perform this rebuild are a calibrated torque wrench with 3/4 inch socket, a 5/8 inch wrench, calipers, a brass scraper, new glass and gaskets, and molly coat. So the first thing that I'm going to do is get my gauge on a clean flat surface. As you can see here, I've already released the tension from these nuts, but when you do this on your bench, you're going to want to remove the nuts from the outside moving in. And the reason that you want to do that is you want to relieve the stress on the glass the opposite of the way that you apply it, so that'll hopefully prevent that glass from cracking when you disassemble the gauge. So the first thing I'll do is remove the nuts, working my way out from the ends. You can see that we have a Jerguson Rating Tag in the lower right hand corner of this with these two washers, so I'll remove that. So this Jerguson tag will contain all sorts of important information like your model number and the design pressure, as well as the chamber material, the type of glass that was used, the gasket material, if you used a shield or not, the bolt torque, the order number, and then a spare kit's part number for your gauge. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove my cover. You can see that this gasket here sits in the recessed surface on this cover. This is what's called a cushion gasket, and its main function is to prevent glass to metal contact when you're torquing the bolts down. This is a non-wetted part, so we'll dispose of that. This is a piece of transparent glass. You can see it's flat and polished on both sides. On the side here would be the glass size, which in this case is a size 5 and a 6-digit heat code, and we'll move that to the side. This is the gauge chamber. It also has a recessed surface in it that this gasket is sitting in, so we'll dispose of that gasket. It's important to note that you always want to get rid of your glass and gaskets whenever you're performing a rebuild, because glass or gaskets can relax over time, and glass can have scratches or high stress concentration in it that you might not be able to see, and then when if the gauge were to fail, it would fail at that point. So you always want to dispose of your glass and gaskets. So we'll move the chamber off, and then we'll remove the second set of glass and gaskets. So I'm going to dispose of all this. Alright, so now we've got our gauge fully disassembled. And what we're going to want to do is inspect our components. Now, we always recommend replacing the bolting when you're rebuilding a gauge, but at the very least, you should check your bolt and make sure that the nut can spin freely all the way down the length of the thread. And the reason is you don't want to get it hung up on anything, because that'll affect your bolt torque when you go to tighten this gauge up. So you want to make sure that that nut isn't getting hung up and can spin freely all the way down the length of the thread. So these are new bolts, so we'll be reusing these. The next thing you want to do is inspect the chamber for any pitting damage or steam cuts, gouges, or scars. These defects can be removed using 1 to 2 skim cuts on a milling machine, but a minimum material thickness of 0.100 inches between the through bore and that recessed gasket surface has to be maintained. So that's where our calipers come in. See if I can. So what we're measuring there is that little point of thickness on that recessed surface. So we check that, and that's good. You also want to repeat that process for your recessed surface on your covers. A lot of times if you're rebuilding a gauge, that gasket can really become part of that surface. So that's where the brass scraper comes in. You want to use this brass scraper to scrape the metal off of that recessed surface, because brass is a soft metal, so it's not going to gouge or do anything like that to the covers or the chamber. So if you inspect all that and everything looks good, then it's time to reassemble the gauge. So with a transparent gauge, I'll start by putting my bolts in the cover. Like you see here. get that set up on my table so that I have all the bolts sticking up like that. Now at this point, I'll put in my new cushion gasket on the lower cover, and then my new piece of glass. Try and get that centrally located in there. I'll place the gasket in on my chamber, and then set that down on that glass. Make sure it's all centered up. Put my seal gasket on the top side of the chamber, my second piece of glass, and then I'll put my gasket in my cover, and I'll place that on top. Alright, so now we've got the gauge mostly assembled. At this point, I'll put my nuts on finger tight. Before you put your nut down, you always want to use some Molly coat on those bolt heads, because you want to make sure that you don't have any friction and that you're getting the proper torque when you go to measure it with your torque wrench. So normally I'd be applying Molly coat to all of those bolt threads. Each one of these nuts has a flat side to it, so you want to make sure that flat side goes down on the cover. Last but not least, I'll put my rating tag with my washers. Lower right hand corner, one bolt up. Alright, so now our gauge is rebuilt and all the nuts are finger tight. At this point, I'll take my calibrated torque wrench and I'll adjust it to 5 foot-pounds. And what you want to do is you want to start in the center and then work your way out. And what you're doing is putting you're dispersing the pressure evenly on the glass. You don't want to work from one end to the other, because then you build up all the stress in one direction and then that glass will get stressed. So you want to start in the middle and then work your way out. So with a transparent gauge, I need my other wrench to hold nuts. So I start in the center, put my wrench on the nut, and then 5 foot-pounds, 5 foot-pounds, and then I'll work my way out. So alright, now I got that tightened down to 5 foot-pounds. I would repeat that process in 5 foot-pound increments all the way up to 32. So I would next go to 10 foot-pounds, start in the middle, and then, work my way out. And that's how you do that all the way up to 32 foot-pounds. So all reassembled gauges should be hydro tested for a minimum of 5 minutes before returning the gauge to service. And we recommend the hydro test pressure is 1.5 times the gauge rating as seen on this tag right here. Jerguson requires the use of OEM parts for all repairs on this product, and in order to protect the warranty, maintain plant and personnel safety, and maintain reliable operations. That concludes this instructional maintenance video. For more information, visit www.jerguson.com.